traveling on inland waterways was so important in the 18th century. We kind of have totally missed the boat on that in modern day America. We are mostly travel by cars, and some people might travel by bus or by train, whatever. But very few people get to work or have their job working on inland waterways, rivers, and lakes. But that was so important in the 18th century, and so I wanted to touch on a couple of different books that talked about some of this commerce and what it was like boating, maybe for a job or to get someplace in the 18th century. Peter Kalm was traveling in North America in 1749, 1750, and he talks about his travels in North America. And he spends some time traveling from New York City up to Albany, New York, along the Hudson River. He explains this trip in detail, and it's really, I mean, you can imagine it would have been very much an idyllic trip. You can imagine sailing up the Hudson from New York City to Albany, New York, and it's a nice quiet boat. It's a sailboat. That's one of the nice things. You don't have this loud vibration and motor the whole time. You're taking your time, you're going up the river. If the tide and the wind isn't with you, you just stop, you anchor, you wait a little while, and then you keep going. So he takes several days, and he describes this entire trip, what the scenery is like, the kinds of houses or fields, the trees, all that geography as he's going up the river. And then he talks about the commerce that's going on. And he describes the boats for us, which is really nice. He says all the yachts which ply between Albany and New York belong to Albany. They go up and down the River Hudson as long as it is open and free from ice. They bring from Albany boards or planks and all sorts of timber, flour, peas, and furs, which they get from the Indians, or which they smuggle from the French. Oh, that was good. They come home almost empty and only bring a few merchandises with them, among which rum is the chief. And then he goes on and he describes the boats particularly. The yachts are pretty large and have a good cabin in which the passengers can be very commodiously lodged. They're commonly built of red cedar or white oak. Frequently the bottoms consist of white oak with the sides of red cedar, because the latter withstands the putrefaction much longer than the former. The red cedar is likewise apt to split when it hits anything, against anything, and the River Hudson is in many places full of sands and rocks, amongst which the keel of these yachts sometimes hits. Therefore, they choose white oak for the bottom, as being the softer wood and not splitting so easily. Maybe he means maybe not softer, but less brittle. And the bottom being continually underwater, it is not so much exposed to putrefaction and holds out much longer. He goes on to describe other smaller boats, canoes, bateaus, great descriptions here. And I would love to read his whole piece about traveling, and all his descriptions from New York to Hudson. That's a great read there. Peter Kalm is always very, very informative when you read him. Maybe a little too, descriptive of the trees and the flora, unless you're really excited about that. Another kind of travel that was going on in this time period and a little bit later was using boats to both sort of explore into areas, or using the rivers and boats to explore and to actually move households to settle in an area. And this book, Westward into Kentucky, Narrative of Daniel Trabu, a great book for understanding that. It's written as a kind of a family history, a family story of going and settling into the Kentucky area. A lot of very interesting stories in this book. They want to move from, I don't know where they're at, probably Virginia, into this Kentucky area, and they gather together their whole household, a very large family, and all their livestock and people and all this good stuff. They go to, well, here, let me read. we went on to Redstone and got a large boat. And we put all our horses, all our carriages and goods and our people. And our boat was heavily loaded. So this is one very large flatboat. They didn't build it. They were boat builders in this Redstone area, building boats for people who were going into the west and settling into Kentucky. Our boat was very heavily loaded and was more apt to run aground than any of the other boats. There are multiple boats with them. There are 5 or 6 different families together traveling by boat. It says upwards to 200 or 300 souls on board all these kind of boats, all traveling together down the river. We got along as well as the rest of the boats until we came to a riffle some distance below the Kanawha. I don't know, it was like a little river that came in there, at an island that is called Dead Man's Island. So they're rapids, I think is what he means by riffles there. So it was agreed by Mr. Lockett and myself that he would steer the boat and I would be in the front of the boat and wave my hand and direct him which way to steer. And we kept exactly after another boat that was before, and on a sudden our boat stove against the end of a log that was underwater. The boat made a sudden stop and all the horses and all the people fell down. I observed the boat was still and the water ran as swift as a mill tail, so very quickly running water. I saw there was a plank burst at my end and the water was coming in very rapid. We was about 40 or 50 feet from shore. So they're out in the middle of this very swift running river and their flat boat, this isn't a raft. It hits something and it starts to take on water immediately. So he's worried. I hollowed. He says hollowed. I guess it's hollered, or he yelled at Mr. Lockett and waved my hand to him to turn his end to the shore. And he did so, and it took several strokes with the assistance of another hand before they could turn it. And after it, I did in turn holler out to jump out and get it near shore and hold it. And by the time the end got to shore, as the boat was now square across the river, the end that was stove at first was fast, so it was stuck. But when it was turned, it was entirely loosed. So, they kind of ran up onto the log. Well, once they turned the boat, it wasn't on the log anymore. And that was a problem. The men, some of them, was out and held the boat in good time. And I hollered out to the women and children to go to the end and jump out, and the men, black and white, to go through the things. My end began to sink very soon. I and another man cut the ropes that tied the horses, and the boat sunk. The horses swam out. I think from the time that the boat struck the log until it sunk, it was no longer than 3 minutes. The people was all saved, but we lost a considerable part of our goods. If the hind end had turned the other way, it is thought that most of the women and children would have been drowned. We was very thankful that kind Providence had saved us, although we saw a great many of our things swimming off, and at their appearance, there was not a murmur or regret, but thankful that it was no worse than it was. So there were many dangers in this travel. Not only were they were having problems with nature, but there was also the Native Americans that were upset with them at the time, and they were worried about that. There was difficulty with the river itself and with the frail boats that they were using to travel up and down the river. But quite an adventure, and so many of these narratives that we read from this time period, you get a great amount of detail, or at least understanding that they used the rivers as the highways of the time period. They were the only great way to get into the interior of the continent in any quick fashion at all. So if anybody wanted to get anywhere quickly, they're going to use the rivers as these sort of highways into the interior of North America. And they also use them as the great way of transport. Whether they're using in civilized areas, where they're towns or whatever, Obviously, they're using them to transport goods back and forth. So really, really important. And we lost all that, don't we? Do we hardly use our rivers at all, except for maybe some, grain transport up and down the very biggest of the rivers, like the Ohio River or, say, the Mississippi River, where they use them to haul goods. But for the vast majority of us, we really don't think about traveling by river at all. Well, I want to thank you for coming along on this adventure today as we read about traveling by river, about these boats that they used in the time period, and hopefully actually we'll be able to get a little bit deeper into that topic, into some videos where we actually do some boat building, maybe do a little bit of traveling by river with a couple different kinds of boats. So that ought to be a lot of fun. That's in the future, so hold out for that. We'll be doing some of those things. Those are in the works as we speak. I want to thank you guys for coming along on this adventure and for all your great support on our channel when you share our videos or you support us in so many other different ways. Thank you so much for joining me today, and thanks for watching.